In 1929, on October 24th, inside the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company plant on Tioga Street, North Philadelphia, the machines did not stop. They never stopped. 3,000 workers pushed through those iron gates that morning the same way they did every morning, heads down, lunch pails swinging, the smell of solder and copper already thick in the cold air before they even reached their stations. The line foreman, a thick-armed man named Earl Decker, was already pacing the floor at 5:30, clipboard in hand, checking output numbers from the overnight shift. The numbers were good. The numbers were always good. That was the thing about the Tioga Street plant. It ran like a clock that had never once needed winding. Outside those walls, America was cracking open. Chapter 1. The Battery Company. That bet everything on radio on Wall Street. The stock market was in freefall. Banks were locking their doors. Families who had felt safe just a week before were suddenly staring at empty accounts. Bread lines were forming in cities across the country. The word depression was being spoken in living rooms, in church pews, in the back seats of taxicabs. The whole country felt like a man who had just been hit and had not yet fallen. Inside the Tioga Street plant, nobody felt that fall. Not yet. Because the man running the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company had already seen what no one else had seen. His name was James Skinner, and where other executives were watching the economy and adjusting, Skinner was watching something else entirely. He was watching American families. He was watching what they did in the evenings after dinner. He was watching where they gathered, and what he saw told him something that changed everything. They sat around their radios. Hi, viewers. Think about the last time a single object completely changed how your family spent time together at home. Drop the name of that device in the comments right now. And if you have never heard the full story of what Philco really was, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what comes next will genuinely shock you. Skinner did not arrive at radio by accident. He arrived at it through a kind of cold engineering logic that was the signature of every decision he would ever make. Batteries-powered radios. The Philco made the best batteries in America, a reputation built not on marketing claims but on actual performance data that electronics manufacturers kept internal and trusted. Skinner looked at that chain and pulled it. If the company that made the best batteries started making the radios those batteries powered, what would stop them? The answer, it turned out, was nothing. By the end of 1930, just 1 year after Skinner made the pivot, Philco had captured more than a quarter of the entire American radio market. Not a segment, the whole market. 1 in 4 radios sold in the United States that year carried the Philco name. The plant on Tioga Street, which had been built for battery manufacturing, was already too small. Construction crews were expanding the floor space while the existing lines ran full tilt. Because demand was outpacing every projection the company had made. Earl Decker, the floor foreman who had paced that plant since the battery days, now oversaw a workforce that had tripled in 18 months. He walked longer floors past more machines producing more units than he had ever managed before. He had seen the company change shape almost overnight, and still the machines did not stop. The speed of what Philco had just done was something competitors watched with a feeling they could not immediately name. It was not quite admiration. It was not quite fear. It was the specific discomfort of watching someone move faster than you thought the rules of the industry allowed. But here is the part James Skinner never told his board of directors. The part that existed only in the private confidence of a man who had been right so many times that being right had started to feel like a permanent condition rather than a result. He believed Philco could define what the American home looked like from the inside out, not just supply it, define it. He believed the company's engineering precision was a kind of destiny, that companies built on real technical superiority do not lose, they only grow. That belief was not wrong, but it was incomplete in a way that would take 20 years to fully reveal itself, and by the time it did, the cost would not be measured in dollars. Chapter 2. The radio that moved into every American home. On a Tuesday evening in March of 1934, in a row house on Cambria Street in North Philadelphia, Margaret Callahan set the dinner table around the radio. She did not move the radio to the table. She moved the table to the radio, pulled it 3 feet closer to the living room, arranged the 4 chairs so that her husband Thomas, her 2 boys, and her mother-in-law could all sit facing the large wooden cabinet standing in the corner. The Philco Model 60 Special, walnut cabinet, cloth grill. The family had saved 11 months to buy it. That evening, the radio was the center of the house. Not the stove, not the fireplace. The radio. This was not a quirk of the Callahan family. Across Philadelphia, across Pittsburgh, across Cleveland and Chicago, and St. Louis, and every mid-sized American city with a working-class neighborhood and a factory paycheck coming in on Fridays. Families were doing the same thing, arranging their evenings around the signal, timing dinner to be finished before a particular program, putting the children to bed during commercials so the adults could hear the rest of a broadcast without interruption. The Philco radio was not a product. It had become a piece of American domestic life the way the kitchen table was a piece of it. You did not question whether you needed one. You saved until you could afford one, and when you could, you bought a Philco. Because Philco meant the signal would come in clear, the cabinet would not crack, and the thing would still be working 5 years from now when the neighbors came over on New Year's Eve. James Skinner understood this, and unlike most executives who would have looked at that kind of brand loyalty and called it a marketing success, Skinner called it a responsibility. He did not want Philco radios in American homes because it was good for quarterly earnings. He wanted them there because he believed the company had earned the right to be there. And that belief drove engineering decisions that competitors found almost baffling in their intensity. In 1934, when Philco controlled 43% of the American radio market, the engineering team led by Albert Reed introduced the Philco Model 20 Cathedral. It was not the most expensive radio on the market. It was not the biggest. What it was better. The reception range exceeded every comparable unit by a measurable, testable, demonstrable margin. The internal components were assembled to tolerances that most manufacturers reserved for military or medical equipment. Reed had pushed his team for 2 years to close every gap between what the radio could do and what it was currently doing, and the Model 20 was the result. When the Model 20 hit store shelves, department store managers in Philadelphia reported that customers were asking for it specifically by model number, not by brand, by model number, which was something that simply did not happen with consumer electronics in 1934. Word spread the way word spread before television, through neighbors, through church groups, through the men at the plant who told the men on the next shift who told their wives, who told the women at the market. The Philco Model 20 worked better. That was the whole of it. And in a market where most manufacturers were selling good enough, better was a word that traveled fast. By the end of 1934, the Tioga Street plant was running 4 production lines simultaneously, and James Skinner had authorized the purchase of an additional facility in Sandusky, Ohio, to absorb the overflow. The company was no longer a radio manufacturer, it was the radio manufacturer, the standard against which all other standards were measured. Thomas Callahan came home on a Friday in December of that year and told Margaret that the men on his floor had been talking about a new Philco model coming in the spring. They did not know the model number yet. They just knew it was coming, and they were already making space for it in their minds the way you make space for something you intend to own. That was the position Philco held in the winter of 1934. Not just trust, not just loyalty, anticipation. The company had built its way into the American imagination. And the question no one inside the Tioga Street plant was asking, the question that had never once appeared in a board meeting, a production review, or an engineering debrief, was this: what happens to a company that has made itself indispensable when the thing it is indispensable for stops being what people need? That question had no urgency in December of 1934. It would. Chapter 3. 11,000 workers inside one unstoppable American machine. Stand at the edge of the Tioga Street production floor in 1941 and try to take it all in at once. You cannot. The building runs longer than 2 city blocks from end to end. Overhead, the roof trusses stretch 40 feet above the floor, and the space between is filled with a constant mechanical sound that is less a noise and more a physical condition, something you feel in your chest before your ears process it. 2,000 machines operate simultaneously. The air temperature near the soldering stations reaches 107 degrees in July. Workers at those stations keep rags tucked into their belts, not for show, but because sweat on the hands causes slips, and slips cause burns, and burns mean lost production time, which Earl Decker does not allow. The conveyor lines run from 6 in the morning until 10 at night, 6 days a week. Every hour, 132 finished radio units move off the end of the primary assembly line, are inspected, are boxed, and are loaded onto trucks at the receiving dock on the east side of the building. 132 units per hour. The math is simple and staggering. Over 4 million radios shipped from this single facility in 1941 alone. 4 million. If you stacked those radios end to end, the line would stretch from Philadelphia to Chicago and then 100 miles past it. At peak employment, the Tioga Street plant held 11,200 workers across 3 shifts, 11,200 people, each of them with a role so specific that the foreman's charts looked like the schematic of a human machine. This station handles coil winding, this one handles chassis assembly, this one handles final calibration, this one handles quality check, this one handles packaging, and on, interlocking, precise, without margin for improvisation. Among those 11,200, there was a man named Robert Callahan. Robert was Thomas and Margaret Callahan's oldest son. He had come onto the floor at 19, the same age his father had been when he started. He worked the coil winding station on the second shift, 2 in the afternoon until 10 at night, 6 days a week. His hands, by the time he had been on the job 18 months, had developed a specific callus pattern on the right index finger and thumb that his mother noticed one Sunday at dinner and said nothing about, because she recognized it. It was the same pattern his father had, the Philco callus, the mark of a man who worked the line. Robert did not find this grim. He found it solid. The plant was the most stable thing he had ever known. It paid $22.50 a week. Enough for an apartment on the north side, enough for groceries and transit and a movie on Saturday nights, and enough to put $7 into savings every month. The company offered health coverage and a pension that vested after 12 years. Robert intended to be there for 12 years and then for 20 more after that. The neighborhood around the plant had organized itself, over 2 decades, entirely around the factory's schedule. The diner on the corner opened at 5:30 in the morning to catch the first shift workers coming in. The bar 2 blocks east opened at 10 at night to catch the second shift workers going home. The church on Lehigh Avenue scheduled its Sunday service at 9 o'clock specifically because it fell in the gap between shift changes, so that the maximum number of plant workers could attend. The plant was not part of the community. The plant was the community. Every other institution, the school, the church, the corner store, the transit line, existed in relationship to it, set its hours around it, measured its seasons by it. In the boardroom on the 3rd floor of the administrative building, the one that looked out over the production floor through a wall of glass, James Skinner stood one morning in the fall of 1941 and watched the lines run below him. His company had just posted its strongest quarter in history. Competitors had tried and failed to close the gap. Albert Reed's engineering team had already filed 3 new patent shotguns that would lock up key radio technologies for the next decade. Everything below him worked. Everything below him was exactly as it should be. And that was the precise moment the world outside those walls had decided to change in a way that the Tioga Street plant, with all its precision, all its scale, all its 11,200 workers, was not yet built to answer. Chapter 4. The day Philco declared war on television. In 1948, on a November morning in Philadelphia, James Skinner walked into the boardroom and put a photograph on the table. It was a photograph of a television set. Not a Philco television set, a competitor's unit. A bulky, awkward box with a small round screen and a price tag that would have bought a family 2 months of groceries. The image on the screen was blurry, the contrast poor, the reception dependent on weather and antenna placement and a kind of patient goodwill that most American consumers were not prepared to offer indefinitely. Skinner set it on the table and said, "Gentlemen, this is the worst version of the thing that is about to replace everything we make." The room went quiet. He was not wrong. Television was coming. Everyone in the room understood that. What they did not understand, what no one had yet put into clear language, was the speed. In 1946, there were approximately 8,000 television sets in American homes. By 1950, that number would exceed 10 million. The growth curve was not a slope. It was a wall. Philco hit that wall running. Albert Reed's engineering team had already been studying television components for 3 years. When Skinner authorized full production in 1948, the company did not enter the television market as an outsider learning on the job. It entered as a company that had spent 3 years preparing to be exactly where it was. The first Philco television sets reached department store floors in the spring of 1949. Priced at $250 for the entry model, the equivalent of nearly $3,000 today, they were not cheap. But they were good. The picture resolution on the Philco Model H2010 exceeded every comparable unit in the same price range. The cabinet was built to last. The components were assembled to the same tolerances that had made the Model 20 radio a benchmark. Competitors were still measuring themselves against 15 years later. Department store managers in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore reported waiting lists within 6 weeks of the first units arriving. Robert Callahan, now 26 and 3 years into his career on the Tioga Street floor, was reassigned from the radio assembly line to the new television chassis line in the spring of 1949. The work was different, more complex, new components he had to learn, but the rhythm was the same. The conveyor moved. The work came to him. He processed it and sent it forward. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. His line partner, a younger man named Dennis Walsh, who had come up from the radio side with him, told him in the break room one afternoon that the television line was the future of the company and that men who got in early on the television side were men who were going to be fine for the next 30 years. Robert nodded and went back to work. He believed this because the evidence supported it. The line was busy. Orders were backed up. The company was hiring, not cutting. On the 3rd floor, Skinner's confidence had a number attached to it. By 1950, Philco held 22% of the American television market. Top 5. Competing directly with RCA and General Electric, companies that had entered television years earlier and had expected to own it by now. Philco had walked into a new industry against established players and forced its way into the top tier in under 2 years, using the same formula it had always used: better engineering, better quality, relentless precision. The formula had worked with batteries. It had worked with radio. Now, it was working with television. Skinner told his board in December of 1951 that Philco was not behind in the television race. It was in the race. And a company that could pivot from batteries to radio to television, each time within 2 years, each time reaching the top tier of a new market, was a company that understood how industries change and how to change with them. The board agreed. Every number in front of them agreed. They were not failing. They were not even close to failing. And that, it would turn out, was the most dangerous thing in the world. Chapter 5. The Man Who Never Saw the Warning Coming. The alarm rang at 4:47 in the morning. Robert Callahan reached across the nightstand and pressed it down before the second ring, the way a man does when he has been waking to the same sound for so long that his body anticipates it by 30 seconds. The bedroom was dark. The apartment was cold. The radiator in the corner had been making a sound like a man clearing his throat all night, holding that noise instead of heat. He dressed in the dark, Work pants, flannel shirt, the heavy canvas jacket his father had handed down to him, the same jacket Thomas Callahan had worn to the Tioga Street gate for 16 years before his knees gave out. The jacket smelled like the factory. It had always smelled like the factory, through every washing, through every summer it spent in the closet. Somewhere between machine oil and warm metal and something more chemical that Robert had stopped trying to name. He ate standing at the kitchen counter, bread, butter, black coffee. Out the door by 5:15, down the stairs, onto a street already populated with men in canvas jackets moving north, toward the plant, with the particular forward lean of people who have somewhere specific to be and are already counting the minutes. The bus came at 5:27. When it was late, the men on the corner said nothing. They stood, shoulders against the cold, breath making small clouds the wind took and dispersed. Waiting was part of the job. The job started at 6, but the job also started the moment you left the apartment, because from that moment forward you were a plant worker in transit, not a private person doing private things. Inside the Tioga Street gate, the sound hit him. Every morning, the same way, a wall of noise, full volume, the second the door opened. Conveyor chains, pneumatic presses, the high-pitched oscillation of the testing equipment at the far end of the floor, and underneath all of it, steady as a heartbeat, the deep mechanical hum of the ventilation system that moved warm air through the building and never managed to move quite enough of it. His station was in the middle of Building C, third row from the east wall. He had worked it for 4 years. He could walk to it with his eyes closed, which he had tested once on a lost bet with Dennis Walsh and won by 2 feet. The work paid $29.60 a week in 1952. Robert had learned to measure enough with precision. Enough was the apartment paid, groceries bought, $11 a month into savings, an occasional Saturday dinner that his wife Margaret called their luxury and meant sincerely. Enough was not surplus. It did not leave room for a broken transmission or an unexpected medical bill without a conversation about the savings account. But enough was real, and real was what Robert had come to value above the idea of more. The physical cost of the work accumulated the way debt accumulates, invisibly. Then, all at once, Robert's right shoulder had started in 1950. No single injury, no moment he could point to. One morning it was tight, the next morning tighter. By the following winter it was a low, constant presence he carried the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, always aware of the weight, always adjusting for it. Dennis Walsh had 2 fingers on his left hand that had lost sensation from 3 years of operating a particular press tool. The company doctor had noted it and suggested lighter-duty work when available. Lighter-duty work was not always available. These were not complaints either man raised in the break room. The break room conversation was about the Eagles, about the weather, about which foreman was reasonable, and which one counted your minutes in the bathroom. The shoulder and the fingers were private matters. The cost of the wage, and the wage was the point. Margaret asked him once, on a Sunday morning over coffee, whether he ever thought about other kinds of work. He looked at her across the table with the patience of a man answering a question that did not quite connect to the world as he understood it. He told her that his father had worked the same floor for 19 years and retired with a pension that paid the rent and put food on the table. He told her the company had health coverage, a pension that vested in 6 more years, and that the line was still running full tilt. He told her there was no other kind of work that offered what the Tioga Street plant offered, a man who showed up every day and did his job. Margaret refilled his coffee and said nothing else. She believed him. He believed himself. They both had every reason to. Because in the spring of 1952, the Tioga Street plant was still running 24 hours a day. Robert's badge still swiped, the conveyor still moved. The alarm still rang at 4:47. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. And in an office 3 miles away, in a building Robert Callahan had never entered and never would, a single internal memo had just been filed and quietly set aside. written by a 29-year-old cost analyst named Gerald Marsh, who had spent 6 months tracking the pricing moves of a group of Japanese electronics manufacturers that most of Philco's leadership had not yet learned to pronounce correctly. Gerald Marsh had given his memo a plain, direct title. The title was A Warning. Nobody called a meeting about it. Chapter 6 is the memo. Nobody on the third floor, read in 1955. On a Monday morning in January, Gerald Marsh walked into the Philco executive suite on the third floor of the Tioga Street Administrative Building and asked the receptionist for 15 minutes with the head of product planning. He waited 2 hours. Then he was told the meeting would have to be rescheduled. Marsh was not a dramatic man. He did not storm out. He did not raise his voice. He picked up his folder, the one containing the updated version of the memo he had first filed 8 months earlier, now thicker, now sharper, now supported by an additional 60 pages of pricing data that he had pulled from import records, trade journals, and retail surveys across 7 American cities. And he walked back to his desk on the second floor and set it down next to the others. There were 3 folders now, 3 versions of the same warning, each one more detailed than the last. None of them had produced a meeting that lasted longer than 20 minutes. The data inside those folders told a story that the third floor had not yet decided to hear. Japanese electronics manufacturers, companies like Sony and Matsushita, names that American consumers in 1955 could not yet place on a map, were selling radio components and small consumer electronics into the low end of the American market, at prices that made Philco's cost structure look like it had been designed for a different century. Not a different decade. A different century. The average Philco tabletop radio retailed for $42 in 1955. The comparable Japanese-made unit was retailing for $19 and dropping. Marsh had done the math 17 different ways. Every version of the math said the same thing. If the gap between those 2 numbers continued to widen, and every trend line in his data said it would, Philco's mid-range market position would begin to erode within 3 years. Not collapse. Erode. Quietly. Gradually. The way a riverbank loses ground. Imperceptibly from one month to the next. Then suddenly, all at once, gone. On the third floor, James Skinner was looking at different numbers. Philco's 1954 annual revenue had reached $270 million. Television sales were up 11% year over year. The company held a top 5 position in every major product category it competed in. The engineering team under Albert Reed had just completed a new patent filing that Skinner believed would define the next generation of television tuner technology. From where Skinner sat, the company was not standing still. It was advancing, carefully, methodically, in the way that precision-driven organizations advance, with evidence, with testing, with the kind of measured confidence that comes from having been right for 25 consecutive years. The problem was not that Skinner ignored Marsh's data. The problem was that Skinner read it and reached a conclusion that was almost correct. He concluded that the low-end foreign market was a separate segment, that Philco's customers, the families who bought on quality, on reputation, on the Philco name that had been in their parents' homes before it was in theirs, were not the families buying $19 Japanese radios. He concluded that competing in the low end would require cost cuts that would compromise the engineering standards that had built the brand, and that compromising the brand to fight for a segment Philco did not own was a worse risk than ceding that segment entirely. This was not foolish reasoning. It was the kind of reasoning that sounds airtight in a boardroom and proves fatal in a market. Robert Callahan, 2 floors below and 3 miles away in spirit, knew nothing about Gerald Marsh or his folders or the meeting that kept getting rescheduled. Robert knew that the television chassis line was running well, that his shift had hit its production targets 9 weeks in a row, and that Dennis Walsh had just been promoted to line supervisor, which meant the 2 of them no longer took their breaks at the same time. He knew that his daughter, born in March of 1954, needed new shoes. He knew that the savings account held $411. He knew that 6 more years on the line meant a vested pension. He knew everything that mattered in the world he could see. And the world he could not see, the one being documented in 3 manila folders on a second-floor desk by a man named Gerald Marsh, was already moving toward him at a speed that made 6 years feel like a very long time to wait. Chapter 7. The chassis on the table that changed nothing. In 1958, on a Wednesday afternoon in September, Albert Reed called an emergency meeting of the Philco engineering leadership and put a disassembled television chassis on the conference table. It was not a Philco chassis. It was a unit pulled from a Japanese-manufactured television set that had been purchased the previous week from a department store in Trenton, New Jersey, for $89. Reed had taken it apart himself, component by component, and laid every piece out in order. Tubes, resistors, capacitors, the tuner assembly, the power supply, the speaker housing, the way a doctor lays out a patient for examination. He stood at the head of the table and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "Tell me how they built this for $89. The room had no immediate answer, because the answer, when it finally came together over the following 2 hours of that meeting, was deeply uncomfortable. The Japanese unit was not built to Philco's standards. The components were lighter. Some of the tolerances were wider. A Philco engineer examining it with the standards of 1948 in mind would have called it inferior. And in a strict technical sense it was. But it worked. It pulled a picture. It held a signal. It did the thing a television set was supposed to do for a family sitting in a living room on a Wednesday night. And it did all of that for $89, which was $161 less than the entry-level Philco television sitting on the shelf at the same department store in Trenton. Reed understood what he was looking at. He had understood it, in general terms, since Marsh's first memo in 1954. What the disassembled chassis on the table made undeniable was the specifics. This was not a company cutting corners to grab a low-end segment and disappear. This was a manufacturing philosophy, a deliberate engineered approach to cost reduction that did not sacrifice function at the point the consumer actually experienced it. The Japanese manufacturers were not making worse televisions. They were making different ones, optimized for a different question. Not how good can it be, but how good does it need to be? And the answer to that second question for most American families in 1958 was good enough to work. Reliably. At a price that left money for the electric bill. Reed filed a 22-page internal report the following week, recommending immediate restructuring of Philco's manufacturing cost model. He proposed 3 specific changes: a shift to modular component sourcing, a reduction in assembly tolerance requirements for non-critical components, and a wholesale review of the pricing architecture across the television product line. The report reached Skinner's desk in October. By December, 2 of Reed's 3 proposals had been classified as under review. The third had been declined on the grounds that the capital investment required could not be justified against current performance projections. Current performance projections were still strong. That was the trap. Not dishonesty, not laziness. The trap was that the very success Philco had built, the revenue numbers, the market position, the brand value, created a logical case against urgency. If you are performing well, the argument for disruptive internal change always loses to the argument for protecting what is working. The burden of proof falls on the person saying change is necessary, not on the system resisting it. Reed had the proof. He had laid it on the conference table in September. He had put it in 22 pages in October. And he had watched it reach Skinner's desk and come back stamped under review, which in corporate language means, we see it, and we are choosing not to move. Robert Callahan hit his 12-year mark at the Tioga Street plant in the fall of 1958. His pension was now vested. His daughter was 4 years old. His shoulder had settled into a permanent stiffness that a doctor at the company clinic described as occupational wear and recommended he manage with aspirin and periodic rest, neither of which the production line schedule made easy. He told Margaret at dinner the night the pension vested that they were going to be all right. He said it the way a man says something true. He was not wrong about the pension. He was not wrong about the years behind him. He was only wrong about the years ahead. And 3 floors up, in a glass-walled boardroom where the production floor hummed below like a kept promise, the decision that could have changed everything had just been filed under review. It would stay there until it was too late to matter. Chapter 8. The Friday afternoon. Robert Callahan lost everything. In 1961, on a Thursday morning in April, the announcement came through the plant intercom at 7:43. Not a voice, a memo. Slid under the doors of every shift supervisor's office overnight, so that Earl Decker, who had worked the Tioga Street floor for 31 years, found it on his desk when he arrived at 5:30, read it once, set it face down, and did not speak to anyone for 40 minutes. Ford Motor Company had acquired Philco Corporation. The sale had been completed quietly, finalized in corporate offices that none of the 11,000 workers at Tioga Street had ever visited. Using language that none of them would have fully understood even if they had been in the room. What the language added up to was this: Philco, the company that had defined American radio, that had competed its way into the top 5 of American television, that had run those floors without stopping for 30 years, no longer belonged to the men who had built it. It belonged to Ford. The official statement called it a strategic acquisition. It called it an opportunity for growth. It used the word partnership 4 times in 3 paragraphs. Robert Callahan read the memo on the break room bulletin board at 8:15. He stood there long enough that Dennis Walsh, now a floor supervisor, came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Walsh said, "Ford makes cars." And Robert said, "Yeah." And they both went back to work because the conveyor did not stop for acquisitions. But the conveyor did begin to slow. Not that day. Not that month. But the direction was set in 1961 with the kind of quiet finality that only becomes obvious in the looking back. Ford had not purchased Philco because it believed in Philco's future. Ford had purchased the name, the distribution network, the existing contracts, and the engineering patents. The living factory, the people, the floors, the machines, was a cost to be managed, not an asset to be grown. By 1964, the Tioga Street workforce had dropped from 11,200 to 6,800. The cuts came in rounds, each one announced in the same careful language, each one described as a restructuring rather than a retreat. Lines were consolidated. Shifts were merged. Product categories were discontinued one by one, the radio line first, then the mid-range television line, then the high-end cabinetry models that Albert Reed had spent 2 decades refining to a standard no competitor had matched. Reed himself left in 1963. He did not make an announcement. He submitted his resignation on a Tuesday, cleaned out the desk in the engineering suite that he had occupied since 1938, and walked out of the Tioga Street building at 2:30 in the afternoon. The man who had designed the Model 20 cathedral, who had disassembled a Japanese television set on a conference table and told the truth about what it meant, left without a ceremony. Nobody organized one. Earl Decker, 31 years on the floor, was let go in the spring of 1965 as part of a supervisory consolidation. He was 62 years old. His pension from the Philco years was intact. He had that at least. But the pension was calculated on the salary of a floor foreman in 1961 dollars, and by 1965 it bought considerably less than the men who had negotiated it had believed it would. He told his wife the night he came home that he did not know what to do with himself on a Monday morning. She told him he would figure it out. He never entirely did. Robert Callahan survived the 1964 cuts, and the 1966 cuts. He was reassigned twice. First to a reduced television line, then to a component testing station that was itself eliminated in 1968, at which point Robert Callahan, age 45, with 19 years in the plant and a vested pension and a daughter starting high school, was handed a severance letter and walked out of the Tioga Street gate for the last time on a Friday afternoon in November. He stood on the sidewalk outside the gate. The factory was still running behind him, smaller, quieter, a fraction of what it had been, And he stood there for a moment in the November cold, listening to it, the way you listen to a conversation in another room that you are no longer part of. Margaret was home when he got there. He set the letter on the kitchen table and sat down. She put coffee in front of him. They looked at each other across the table that she had moved 3 feet closer to the radio 34 years ago, on a Tuesday evening in March. The radio was long gone. The table was still there. And in that kitchen, in that silence, 19 years of wages and calluses and shoulder that never stopped aching added up to a severance check and a question neither of them could answer. What comes next? By the time it looked like failure, it was already irreversible. Chapter 9. The building that still carries the weight today. Walk past the old Philco plant on Tioga Street today, and the name is still there. You almost miss it. The letters are faded, the original mounting hardware rusted to a color that matches the brick behind it, so that from a distance the sign and the building seem to have merged into a single aging thing, neither quite structure, neither quite signage, both of them just the record of something that happened here once and does not happen anymore. The windows on the upper floors are a patchwork, some replaced, some boarded, done, some still carrying the original glass with cracks running through it like dry riverbeds. On a quiet afternoon, the wind moves through the gaps in a way that makes a sound, low, continuous, without rhythm, that you hear before you realize you are hearing it. It is not quite the sound of machines. It is the space where the sound of machines used to be. The building has been partially repurposed. Ground floor commercial spaces, a logistics operation that uses one of the old loading bays, an artists' collective that moved into the East Wing in the 1990s and stayed because the ceilings were high and the rent was manageable, and the light through those factory windows, even cracked and dirty, was extraordinary in the late afternoon. None of these tenants have much to do with radios or televisions, or the 11,200 people who once filled the floors above them. The official story of what happened to Philco, the version you find in business school case studies and corporate history retrospectives, is a clean one. A company that dominated radio, made a credible run at television, faced a changing market, was acquired, and eventually wound down. A reasonable arc. A story with a beginning and an end that can be explained in 3 paragraphs. That version is accurate. It is also incomplete in a way that costs something to acknowledge. It leaves out Earl Decker on a Monday morning with nowhere to go. It leaves out Albert Reed walking out at 2:30 on a Tuesday with no ceremony and no backward glance from the floors he had engineered for 25 years. It leaves out Robert Callahan standing on the sidewalk outside the Tioga Street gate in November of 1968, listening to a factory that no longer needed him run on without him. It leaves out the bar 2 blocks east that closed in 1967 because the second shift that had kept it alive was gone. The diner on the corner that followed in 1969. The elementary school 2 streets over. That began losing enrollment in 1965 and kept losing it for a decade as the families who had built their lives around the plant packed up and followed the work that no longer existed here. Gerald Marsh, the analyst who had filed 3 warnings in 3 folders between 1954 and 1956, whose meeting with product planning had been rescheduled until it was no longer relevant, left Philco in 1962. He went to work for a consulting firm in New York. In 1971, he gave a lecture at the Wharton School of Business in Philadelphia, 7 miles from the Tioga Street plant, about the dynamics of market disruption in mature industries. He did not name Philco by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew which company he was talking about. Today, the neighborhood around the plant carries the weight of what was lost without being able to name it precisely. You feel it in the gaps, the empty lots, the storefronts that cycle through tenants without settling, the particular silence of a place that was once loud for reasons that mattered and is now quiet for reasons that hurt. The building still stands because brick and steel outlast the decisions made inside them. On the east wall of the old production floor, if you know where to look, there is still a faded painted line on the concrete, the boundary marker for one of the original conveyor paths, running the length of the floor and stopping 3 feet from the wall, ending nowhere. It runs to exactly where Robert Callahan's station used to be, and yet the most painful part of this story is not what they lost. It is how close they came to keeping it. Chapter 10. One meeting could have saved 11,000 jobs. Here is what no business school teaches about the Philco story. The decisions that ended the company were not made by careless men. They were not made in ignorance. Gerald Marsh gave them the data. Albert Reed gave them the engineering analysis. The Japanese chassis on the conference table in 1958 gave them the physical proof. James Skinner was not a fool. He was one of the most capable executives in American manufacturing history, a man who had taken a battery company and turned it into a radio empire in under 2 years, who had entered the television market against established giants and forced his way into the top 5 in under 24 months. The decisions that ended Philco were made by a man who had been right for so long that the feeling of being right had become indistinguishable from the act of thinking clearly. That is the thing this story is actually about. Success does not make you blind. It does something more precise than that. It makes you slow. It adds a fraction of a second to every decision. The moment where you check what you know against what worked before. Where you weight the evidence in front of you against the track record behind you. Where the voice that says, "Wait, we need more data," sounds exactly like wisdom because it has sounded like wisdom every other time it spoke. That fraction of a second, compounded across 1,000 decisions made over 5 years, is the distance between Philco and survival. The first truth this story leaves behind is this: the market does not care what you built yesterday. The families who had saved 11 months to buy the Philco Model 60 Special in 1934 were loyal to Philco because Philco was the best answer to their need. When a different company became a better answer at a price they could more easily afford, the loyalty followed the answer. Not because they were disloyal, because that is what loyalty to a need looks like from the outside. It looks like abandonment. It is actually just honesty. The second truth is this: the warning always comes before the company is ready to hear it. Gerald Marsh filed his first memo in 1954. The consequences he described arrived in full in 1964. 10 years. The data was accurate. The timeline was real. The gap between the warning and the response was not a failure of information. It was a failure of urgency. And urgency inside a successful organization is the rarest resource in the building. Because urgency requires admitting that something is wrong, and admitting that something is wrong requires believing that the evidence in front of you outweighs the track record behind you. For James Skinner, in 1954, with $270 million in revenue and a top 5 television position, that calculation did not resolve in Marsh's favor. It should have. The third truth is the one that stays with you. Robert Callahan showed up every day. Earl Decker paced that floor for 31 years. Albert Reed filed 22 pages of engineering analysis and laid a competitor's chassis on a conference table and told the unambiguous truth about what it meant. Dennis Walsh ran his line. Margaret Callahan moved the table 3 feet closer to the radio and believed the thing her husband told her on a Sunday morning over coffee. None of them made the decisions that ended Philco. All of them paid for those decisions. That is the controversy at the center of this story that no business school case study fully confronts. The cost of a leadership failure is never borne primarily by the leadership. It is borne by the Earl Deckers and the Robert Callahans and the workers whose names nobody filed in a folder, the ones who gave the company their backs and their shoulders and their mornings and their 12-year vesting periods, and trusted that the floors would keep running because the floors had always kept running. What if Skinner had called the meeting Marsh requested in January of 1955? What if Reed's 3 proposals had all been approved in December of 1958 instead of filed under review? What if the capital investment required to restructure Philco's manufacturing cost model had been approved against future performance projections instead of rejected against current ones? Could Robert Callahan have retired from that floor instead of being walked off it? Could Earl Decker have found something to do with himself on a Monday morning? Could the bar 2 blocks east and the diner on the corner and the elementary school 2 streets over have stayed open another generation? Nobody knows. What the Tioga Street plant knows, what the faded letters on the brick, and the conveyor line that runs to nowhere and the wind through the cracked windows all know, is that the answers to those questions existed. They were available. They were written down in 3 folders on a second-floor desk by a 29-year-old analyst who asked for 15 minutes and waited 2 hours and was told to reschedule. Empires do not collapse because they fail. They collapse because they hesitate at the exact moment they should move. If this story made you think about a company you know, a brand you grew up with, an industry you work in, a name that used to mean something and now means something different or means nothing at all, drop it in the comments. The Philco story is not old history. It is a pattern that repeats. In every industry, in every generation, wearing different names on different buildings in different cities. And if you want to be there when we tell the next one, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next story on this channel is one that almost nobody knows and everyone should. These are the stories that explain how the world you live in actually got built. You do not want to miss them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts below, and we will see you in the next one.